The thunder crashed against the Montana sky as Julia Davenport collapsed onto the weathered porch of the isolated cabin, her trembling fist striking the wooden door 3 times before her knees nearly gave out beneath her. She clutched her swollen belly with one hand, the other bracing against the doorframe as rain cascaded down her face, mingling with tears of exhaustion and fear. Owen Zachariah hadn't expected visitors, not in this weather, not on his remote ranch 15 miles outside of Douglas, Wyoming territory. The year was 1876, and he'd deliberately chosen this isolated stretch of land to escape the ghosts that haunted him. The pounding on his door pulled him from a dreamless sleep, his hand instinctively reaching for the Colt revolver he kept beside his bed. The woman who stood before him when he yanked open the door was a startling sight, soaked to the bone, mud-spattered, and unmistakably pregnant. Her dress, once fine but now torn and filthy, clung to her trembling form. Dark circles shadowed eyes that looked both terrified and determined. She opened her mouth to speak, but Owen raised his hand, silencing her. "You'll eat before you tell me your name," he said gruffly, stepping aside to let her enter. "No explanations needed until you're warm and fed." Julia stumbled across the threshold, relief washing over her features as the warmth of the cabin enveloped her. She hadn't eaten in nearly 2 days, and the journey had drained what little strength she had left. Owen moved with surprising efficiency for a man who lived alone. He stoked the dying embers in the fireplace, added fresh logs until flames leaped to life, and then pulled a chair close to the hearth. "Sit," he commanded, his voice rough but not unkind. "That dress needs to come off before you catch your death." Julia's eyes widened, one protective hand moving to her belly. "I've got a shirt and trousers that might fit you well enough," Owen clarified, already rummaging through a trunk at the foot of his bed. "You can change behind that screen. I'll heat some stew." The clothes he handed her were clean but worn, a flannel shirt soft from many washings, and a pair of trousers with suspenders that she could adjust over her pregnant belly. Behind the privacy screen, Julia peeled off her sodden dress, her fingers numb and clumsy. The baby kicked sharply, as if protesting the cold, and she whispered soothing words as she dried herself with the towel Owen had provided. When she emerged, Owen was ladling thick venison stew into a bowl. He didn't look up, giving her time to settle into the chair by the fire, a quilt now draped over its back. "Eat slowly," he advised, placing the bowl in her hands. "Your stomach won't take kindly to rushing after going without." Julia nodded, taking careful spoonfuls of the savory stew. It was surprisingly good, rich with vegetables and herbs she couldn't identify. Owen busied himself brewing coffee, his broad shoulders tense beneath his cotton shirt. "Thank you," she said softly when she'd eaten half the bowl. "I don't know what I would have done if—" "Not yet," Owen interrupted, glancing over his shoulder. His face was all hard angles in the firelight, strong jaw, straight nose, eyes the color of the storm outside. "Finish eating first." Julia studied him as she continued to eat. He moved with the easy grace of a man accustomed to hard work, but there was something careful in his movements too, as though he were holding himself in check. His cabin was simple but meticulously organized. A rifle hung over the door, books lined a small shelf, and various tools hung from pegs along one wall. It was the home of a man who valued order and self-sufficiency. When she'd emptied the bowl, Owen took it from her and replaced it with a steaming mug of coffee. "Now," he said, settling into a chair across from her, his own mug cradled between calloused hands. "Your name, and why a woman in your condition is traveling alone in this weather." Julia wrapped her fingers around the warm mug, drawing strength from its heat. "Julia Davenport," she began, her voice steadier now. "I was traveling on the eastbound stage to Cheyenne. My husband," her voice caught. "My husband was killed 3 months ago, mining accident near Sacramento. I was heading to my sister's home when the stage was attacked." Owen's expression darkened. "Barton's gang," she nodded. They took everything of value from the passengers. The driver was shot and the horses scattered. Most passengers headed for Douglas on foot, but I couldn't keep pace. She looked down at her protruding belly. I saw smoke from your chimney and hoped. You did right, Owen said, rising to pour more coffee. Douglas is still 10 miles from here. You'd never have made it in this storm. And you, Julia asked, gratitude making her bold. You haven't told me your name. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Owen Zachariah, this is my ranch such as it is. You live here alone? Just me and a few hundred head of cattle on the north pasture, couple of good horses, chickens, he shrugged. It's quiet, I prefer it that way. The rain lashed against the windows and Julia shivered despite the fire's warmth. I've imposed on you enough. Once the storm passes, you'll stay until it's safe to travel, Owen stated firmly. That little one isn't going to wait much longer by the look of things. Julia's hand moved protectively to her belly again. Another month, the doctor said. Owen looked skeptical but didn't argue. You take the bed tonight, I'll sleep by the fire. I couldn't, you can and you will, he said with quiet authority. You need proper rest. That night, lying in Owen's bed with fresh sheets that smelled of sunshine and pine, Julia listened to the rain and the occasional creak of the floorboards as Owen moved about the cabin. For the first time since receiving news of her husband's death, she felt safe. The baby shifted within her, settling into the newfound peace, and Julia closed her eyes, surrendering to exhaustion. Owen sat by the dying fire, staring into the embers and listening to the soft, even breathing of the woman in his bed. Julia Davenport. Her presence disturbed the careful solitude he'd built, yet he couldn't bring himself to resent the intrusion. There was something in her eyes, a determination, a resilience that reminded him of someone he'd tried hard to forget. Dawn broke clear and cold, the storm having blown itself out during the night. Owen was already up, feeding chickens and checking on his horses when Julia emerged from the cabin, wrapped in his quilt. Good morning, she called, her voice carrying across the yard. Owen nodded in acknowledgement, noting how the morning light softened her features, revealing a beauty that exhaustion had concealed the previous night. Her hair was the color of chestnuts, her eyes a clear, steady green. Thought you might sleep longer, he said, approaching the porch. I'm used to early mornings. On my father's farm in Ohio, we were up before the sun. She gestured toward the chicken coop. I could help with the eggs. Owen shook his head. You need to rest. What I need is to feel useful, she countered gently. I've never been good at sitting idle. Something like respect flickered in Owen's eyes. He gestured toward the chicken coop with a tilt of his head. Mind the red hen. She's ornery. Julia smiled, the first genuine smile she'd managed in weeks, and Owen felt something shift inside him, like a rusted lock turning. He quickly turned away, busying himself with the horses while Julia gathered eggs, her movements slow but deliberate. Over breakfast, fresh eggs, bacon, and biscuits that Owen had baked himself, they talked about practical matters. The nearest doctor was in Douglas. The next stage wouldn't pass for another week. The roads would be muddy and treacherous for days after the storm. I've got a wagon, Owen said, pouring more coffee. Could take you to Douglas tomorrow if you're set on going. Julia hesitated, fork halfway to her mouth. I don't want to be a burden. You're not, he said simply. Then, if it wouldn't be an imposition, perhaps I could stay a few more days, just until I regain my strength. Owen studied her for a moment, then nodded once. You can stay as long as you need. Those few days stretched into a week, then two. Julia insisted on earning her keep, taking over cooking and mending tasks while Owen tended to the ranch. They fell into an unexpected rhythm, working alongside each other during the day, sharing quiet meals in the evening. Owen spoke little of himself, but Julia pieced together fragments of his story. He'd been a soldier in the Union Army, had come west after the war, had built this place with his own hands over the past 8 years. She told him about her childhood in Ohio, her marriage to Thomas Davenport, their journey west to California where Thomas had hoped to make his fortune in the gold fields. She spoke of his death matter-of-factly, though Owen noticed how her hand always moved to her belly when she mentioned her late husband, as if reminding herself that a part of him remained. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains, Owen surprised her with a question. "What will you do? At your sister's, I mean." Julia considered this, rocking gently in the chair Owen had built during her second week of stay. "Elizabeth has a small boarding house in Cheyenne. She's offered me work there after the baby comes." She sighed, looking out across the vast landscape. "It's not what I imagined for my life, but it will be a roof over our heads." "You don't sound convinced," Owen observed. Julia looked down at her hands. "I had dreams once. Thomas and we were going to have land of our own, a place where our children could run free." She smiled sadly. "Foolish dreams, perhaps." "Not foolish," Owen said quietly, "just deferred." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. The moment stretched, fragile and significant, until Owen abruptly stood. "Getting cold," he said gruffly. "Should head in." That night, Julia couldn't sleep. The baby was restless, kicking and shifting within her. She paced the small cabin, one hand pressed to the small of her back where a persistent ache had settled. Owen, sleeping on his pallet near the fireplace, woke instantly. "Something wrong?" he asked, sitting up. "Just uncomfortable," she assured him. "The baby is active tonight." Owen rose, pulling on his shirt over his long underwear. He moved to the stove and set water to boil. "My mother used to drink chamomile when she was carrying my sister," he explained, his voice low in the darkness. "Said it calmed the baby." Julia watched as he prepared the tea, struck by this glimpse into his past. It was the first time he'd mentioned his family. "Your mother," she ventured carefully, accepting the steaming cup. "Is she still living?" Owen shook his head. "Consumption. Took her and my sister both, winter of '65. "I'm sorry," Julia said softly. Owen shrugged, though the set of his shoulders betrayed the casualness of the gesture. "Long time ago now, and your father, never knew him, ran off before I was born." He stoked the fire, added another log. "My mother managed on her own, taught me to do the same." "Is that why you're out here alone? Because you're used to managing on your own?" Owen looked at her then, really looked at her, and Julia had the sense he was deciding how much to reveal. "Partly," he admitted. "But there were other reasons to leave civilization behind." "The war," she guessed. He nodded slowly. "Saw things no man should see, did things too." He turned back to the fire. "Found it hard to be around people after. Out here the quiet helps. Does it help, I mean, most days." Julia sipped her tea, considering his words. "I understand wanting to escape. After Thomas died, I wanted to crawl into darkness and never emerge." Her free hand cradled her belly. "But then I would feel the baby move, and I knew I had to keep going, for this little one." "You're stronger than you know," Owen said, surprising her with the gentleness in his voice. "So are you," she replied. "It takes strength to build a life out here alone." Something shifted in Owen's expression, a softening, a moment of vulnerability quickly hidden. "Try to sleep," he said, taking her empty cup. "Dawn comes early." As the days passed, Julia noticed subtle changes in Owen's behavior. He began to linger over meals, sharing stories from his time driving cattle or hunting in the mountains. He built a cradle, working on it in the evenings, his large hands surprisingly deft as they shaped the wood. When Julia thanked him, tears in her eyes, he simply nodded and said, "Baby needs a place to sleep." The third week of Julia's stay brought unexpected visitors, 3 cowboys from a neighboring ranch seeking help with a broken wagon axle. Owen greeted them warily, but invited them in when the wind picked up, carrying the threat of another storm. Julia served coffee while Owen and the men discussed the repairs needed. She felt their curious glances but met them with dignified politeness. "Didn't know Zachariah had himself a wife," one of the cowboys commented as she refilled his cup. Before Julia could correct him, Owen spoke. "Mrs. Davenport is a guest. Her stage was robbed. She's waiting for safer travel conditions." The oldest of the cowboys, a weathered man named Hank, studied them both with knowing eyes. "Lucky she found your place," he remarked, especially in her condition. Yes, Owen agreed, his tone discouraging further comment. Lucky. After the men departed with the replacement axle Owen had provided, Julia found him in the barn, brushing down his mare with methodical strokes. They seemed nice, she offered. Your neighbors. Don't know about nice. Decent enough men, he continued, brushing. Sorry about the assumption. That I was your wife, Julia smiled faintly. No harm done. Owen set down the brush, turning to face her. People will talk. Word will spread that there's a woman staying here. Does that concern you, your reputation? Not mine, yours. Julia's heart warmed at his consideration. I appreciate your concern, but I've faced worse than gossip. Owen nodded, seemingly satisfied. All the same, I'll take you to Douglas tomorrow. Town has a respectable boarding house where you can stay until the next stage comes through. Oh, Julia tried to hide her disappointment. Of course, that's sensible. Owen returned to brushing the horse, his back to her. It's for the best. That night, a spring snowstorm descended from the mountains, blanketing the ranch in several inches of wet, heavy snow. The trip to Douglas was postponed, and Julia secretly welcomed the delay. She had grown comfortable in Owen's cabin with its simple routines and quiet companionship. More than that, she had grown to admire the man himself, his unwavering integrity, his silent strength, his unexpected gentleness. On the fourth morning after the snow, Julia woke to sharp pain radiating across her abdomen. She gasped, clutching the bedsheets as it intensified, then gradually subsided. When she caught her breath, she realized what was happening. Owen, she called, her voice tense. I think the baby is coming. Owen appeared in the doorway instantly, as if he'd been waiting for her call. His eyes widened momentarily before his expression settled into determined calm. How far apart are the pains? I don't know. That was the first strong one. I've been uncomfortable all night, but she broke off as another contraction began, less intense than the first but unmistakable. Owen moved with decisive efficiency, stoking the fire, heating water, gathering clean linens. My mother was a midwife, he explained, seeing Julia's surprised expression. I helped her sometimes, know the basics. Your mother trained you as a midwife. Julia managed a smile despite her discomfort. Said a man ought to know how life begins as well as how it ends. He placed a gentle hand on her forehead, checking for fever. You're not hot, that's good. Throughout the day, Julia's labor progressed steadily. Owen stayed close, offering water, supporting her as she walked around the cabin between contractions, speaking encouragement in his low, steady voice. As evening approached and the pains intensified, Julia clutched his hand, drawing strength from his unwavering presence. I'm afraid, she admitted during a brief respite, her hair damp with sweat. You're doing fine, Owen assured her, wiping her brow with a cool cloth. Strong as any woman I've ever seen. What if something goes wrong? We're so far from help. Owen met her gaze directly. Nothing's going to go wrong, but if it did, I'd get you help. Whatever it took. She believed him, and that belief carried her through the most difficult hours that followed. When the time came to push, Owen positioned himself at the foot of the bed, his usual stoicism replaced by focused determination. I can see the head, he announced, his voice thick with emotion Julia had never heard before. Dark hair like yours. One more push, Julia, that's it. With a final, tremendous effort, Julia felt the baby slide from her body. There was a moment of terrifying silence, and then a lusty cry filled the cabin, strong and indignant. A boy, Owen said, his voice cracking slightly as he wrapped the infant in a clean blanket. You have a son, Julia. He placed the wriggling bundle in her arms, and Julia gazed down at her son's red, wrinkled face with overwhelming love. Hello, little one, she whispered, counting tiny fingers and toes. You've had quite a journey. Owen busied himself with the practical aftermath, changing linens and brewing tea fortified with honey. When he returned to Julia's side, she was still staring in wonder at the baby, now quietly nursing at her breast. Thank you, she said, looking up at Owen with tears in her eyes. I couldn't have done this without you. Owen cleared his throat, clearly moved but uncomfortable with her gratitude. "You did all the work," he said gruffly. "What will you call him?" Julia looked down at her son, considering. "Thomas, after his father," she decided. "Thomas Owen Davenport." Owen's eyes widened slightly, and something flickered across his face, surprise, followed by an emotion Julia couldn't quite name. "You don't have to," he began. "I want to," Julia interrupted gently. "You brought him safely into this world. You deserve to be remembered in his name." Owen said nothing, but he reached out tentatively, one rough finger stroking the baby's downy cheek. The infant turned toward the touch, his tiny mouth making sucking motions in his sleep. Something changed in Owen's expression, then a softening, a surrender. The days following Thomas's birth established new patterns in the cabin. Julia recovered quickly, but Owen insisted she rest as much as possible. He took on additional chores without comment, somehow finding time to rock the cradle when Thomas fussed or bring Julia fresh water when she nursed. One evening, as Julia sat by the fire with the sleeping baby in her arms, Owen returned from checking the cattle. He stomped snow from his boots and hung his coat by the door, his gaze falling on mother and child with an expression Julia had begun to recognize longing, quickly masked. "There's something I need to say," he announced, pulling up a chair across from her. Julia tensed, anticipating his reminder that she should continue to Douglas as soon as she was strong enough. Instead, Owen leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond her shoulder. "I was married once." Of all the things Julia had expected him to say, this wasn't among them. She remained silent, giving him space to continue. "Her name was Sarah. We married just before I left for the war. I was 20, she was 18. He drew a deep breath. "She was carrying our child when I got word she'd taken sick. Influenza. By the time I got leave to go home, they were both gone." "Oh, Owen," Julia breathed, her heart aching for the young man he had been. "I'm so sorry." "After that, I didn't see much point in coming home from the war alive," he continued, his voice flat. "Took risks I shouldn't have. When it ended and I was still breathing, I came west, figured I'd keep moving until I found a place where the memories couldn't follow. Did you find such a place?" He looked up then, meeting her eyes directly. "Thought I had, until you knocked on my door." Julia held her breath, sensing the weight of this admission. "Having you here, seeing you with the baby, it brings it all back, what I lost, what I might have had." He ran a hand through his hair in a rare gesture of agitation. "But it also reminds me what it is to care about something, someone." "Owen, let me finish," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I know you have plans, your sister's waiting for you, but if you wanted. If you thought you could be happy here." He gestured around the cabin, suddenly looking uncertain. "It's not much, but it's yours if you want it. You and the boy." Julia felt tears welling in her eyes. "Are you asking me to stay?" Owen nodded, his expression vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. "As my wife, if you'll have me. If not, then just stay. The place needs a woman's touch. The boy needs space to grow." "And what do you need, Owen?" she asked softly. He looked at her for a long moment. "I need you," he said simply. "Both of you." Julia gazed down at her sleeping son, then back at Owen, this man who had opened his door to a desperate stranger, who had delivered her baby with steady hands, who now offered her a future she had thought lost forever. "I think," she said carefully, "that we both lost the lives we thought we would have. Perhaps we've been given a chance to build new ones together." "Is that a yes?" Owen asked, the faintest trace of a smile touching his lips. Julia nodded, her own smile breaking through her tears. "Yes." "We'll stay." Owen moved to kneel beside her chair, one hand gently touching Thomas's head, the other finding Julia's fingers and intertwining them with his own. "I promise you won't regret it." "I know," she said, and leaned forward to press her lips gently to his. They were married 2 weeks later by a traveling preacher who stopped at the ranch, seeking shelter for the night. The ceremony was simple, just the two of them. Baby Thomas sleeping peacefully in his cradle, and the elderly preacher who seemed delighted by the unexpected duty. "Don't see many weddings out this way," he commented as he signed the marriage certificate. especially not with a family already started. He winked at Julia, who blushed but held Owen's hand tightly. "We do things our own way out here," Owen replied, his usual taciturn manner softened by unmistakable happiness. That night, after the preacher had retired to the small guest room Owen had built onto the cabin the previous week, husband and wife stood on the porch together, looking out at the vast Wyoming sky blazing with stars. "Are you happy?" Owen asked, his arm around Julia's waist. She leaned into him, savoring his warmth against the spring night's chill. "Happier than I thought possible again," she answered truthfully. "Are you?" Owen was quiet for a moment, considering. "I spent years believing happiness wasn't for me anymore, that the best I could hope for was peace." He turned to her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "You proved me wrong." Julia reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "We'll make a good life here, Owen, for Thomas and for us." "We already have," he said, and bent to kiss her beneath the endless Wyoming sky. The years that followed brought changes to the Zachariah ranch. Owen built an addition to the cabin, adding a proper bedroom for themselves and a small nursery for Thomas. The herd expanded, necessitating the hiring of 2 young cowboys who lived in the bunkhouse Owen constructed a quarter-mile from the main house. Julia planted a vegetable garden that thrived under her care, and she convinced Owen to add a milk cow and more chickens to their livestock. She learned to ride, at first side saddle in the proper Eastern fashion, but eventually astride like a true Western woman, much to the amusement of their neighbors. Thomas grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his mother's green eyes and his stepfather's determined nature. Owen taught him to ride almost before he could walk, fashioning a special saddle that kept the toddler secure in front of him as they checked the herd together. "He's a natural horseman," Owen would declare proudly, watching Thomas chatter excitedly to the patient mare that had become his dedicated mount. "Like his papa," Julia would reply, her heart swelling at the bond between her husband and son. Thomas called Owen Papa from the moment he began to speak, and Owen cherished the title as the gift it was. Julia kept a small daguerreotype of Thomas Davenport Sr. in a drawer, and when the time was right, she would tell her son about the father who had given him life. But in all the ways that mattered day to day, Owen was Thomas's father, teaching, guiding, loving the boy as his own. When Thomas was 3, Julia discovered she was pregnant again. She told Owen one evening as they sat on the porch, watching Thomas chase fireflies in the yard. Owen's face transformed with wonder. "You're certain?" Julia nodded, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. "Dr. Marshall confirmed it when I was in town yesterday." Owen pulled her into his arms, his embrace careful yet fierce. "Another child," he murmured against her hair. "Our child." "Are you pleased?" Julia asked, though she could feel the answer in the rapid beating of his heart against her cheek. "More than I can say," Owen replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought, after Sarah, that I would have this chance again." Julia wrapped her arms around his waist. "Life has a way of surprising us. Best surprise was you showing up on my doorstep," Owen said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Everything good in my life came from that moment." 7 months later, Rebecca Sarah Zachariah was born on a clear autumn night with Dr. Marshall in attendance this time and Thomas sleeping peacefully in the next room. She had Owen's blue eyes and a shock of dark hair that stood straight up, drawing laughter from the usually solemn doctor. "She's going to be a spirited one," he predicted, handing the swaddled infant to Owen, who held his daughter with a mixture of awe and terror. "She's perfect," Owen whispered, tears tracking unashamedly down his weathered cheeks as he placed the baby in Julia's waiting arms. The following spring brought unexpected visitors to the ranch. Julia's sister Elizabeth and her husband James, traveling through on their way to Oregon where James had purchased land. "Julia," Elizabeth cried, descending from the rented wagon with her arms outstretched. "Look at you positively blooming." The sisters embraced tearfully while Owen and James shook hands, sizing each other up with the wariness of men assessing a potential threat. "Your letters didn't do this place justice," Elizabeth declared, looking around at the expanded cabin, the well-tended garden, the healthy livestock visible in the nearby pasture. "You've built quite a life here." "We have," Julia agreed, adjusting baby Rebecca on her hip while Thomas hid shyly behind her skirts. "It's not what I imagined when I left California, but it's everything I need." That evening, after the children were asleep and James had retired, exhausted from the journey, the sisters sat at the kitchen table while Owen discreetly busied himself with chores outside, giving them privacy to talk. "I never properly thanked you," Julia said, pouring tea into delicate cups, a wedding gift from Elizabeth that Julia saved for special occasions. "If you hadn't offered me a place to stay in Cheyenne, I don't know what I would have done after Thomas died." "That's what sisters are for," Elizabeth replied, reaching across to squeeze Julia's hand. "Though it appears my assistance wasn't needed after all." Julia smiled, glancing toward the window where she could see Owen chopping wood in the yard, his movements powerful and precise. "It was fate, I think, that storm forcing the stage to stop, Barton's gang attacking me, finding this place." "Finding him, you mean," Elizabeth said shrewdly. "He's a good man, your Owen. I can see it in how he looks at you like you hung the moon and stars." "He saved me," Julia said simply. "In every way a person can be saved." "I think perhaps you saved each other," Elizabeth observed, sipping her tea. "From what you've told me of his past, he needed you as much as you needed him." Julia nodded, acknowledging the truth in her sister's words. "We heal each other's wounds. Build something stronger in the broken places." As the years passed, the ranch prospered and grew. Owen's reputation for fair dealing and quality cattle spread, bringing business that allowed them to hire more help and improve the property. Julia started a small school in a converted outbuilding, teaching Thomas and Rebecca alongside the children of neighboring ranchers and their hired hands. Thomas, growing into a thoughtful young man with a talent for numbers, helped Owen manage the increasingly complex ranch accounts. Rebecca, true to Dr. Marshall's prediction, was indeed spirited, riding as well as any cowboy by the age of 8 and declaring her intention to run the ranch herself someday, an ambition that secretly delighted her father. When Julia discovered she was expecting their third child, 10 years after Rebecca's birth, Owen reacted with the same wonder he had shown the first time. "Another miracle," he said, his hair now streaked with silver but his eyes as bright as ever when they looked at her. Their son Robert "Robbie" Thomas Zachariah arrived on a bitter January night during the worst blizzard anyone could remember. The doctor couldn't make it through the snow, so once again it was Owen who delivered his child, his hands steady despite the stakes. "Still remember what my mother taught me," he said afterward, cradling his newborn son while Thomas, now 13, stoked the fire and 12-year-old Rebecca heated water for tea. Both children calm in the crisis because they had been raised by parents who faced challenges head-on. "Your mother would be proud of the man you've become," Julia told him later that night, watching him rock Robbie with the practiced ease of an experienced father. Owen smiled, the expression coming more naturally to him now than it had in those early days. "She would have loved you." "Loved our family." "Tell me about her," Julia requested, settling more comfortably against the pillows. Though they had been married 15 years, there were still stories they hadn't shared, memories they continued to unfold for each other like precious gifts. Owen's deep voice filled the room as he described his mother, her strength, her wisdom, the healing hands that had brought hundreds of babies safely into the world. Julia listened, watching her husband hold their son, and felt the fullness of the life they had built together. On the 20th anniversary of the night Julia had knocked on Owen's door, they held a celebration at the ranch. Friends and neighbors gathered, bringing food and music and good wishes. Thomas, now a handsome young man of 23, had returned from his first year at college in Denver, full of stories and new ideas for the ranch's future. Rebecca, 20, had recently become engaged to the son of a neighboring rancher, a match that delighted both families. 10-year-old Robbie darted among the guests, his energy seemingly inexhaustible. As twilight fell, lanterns were lit around the yard, and someone started playing a fiddle. Couples began to dance, including Thomas with Dr. Marshall's daughter Mary, their heads bent close in conversation. "Looks like another wedding may be in our future," Owen remarked, nodding toward their eldest son. Julia smiled, leaning against her husband's shoulder as they sat on the porch swing he had built for their 15th anniversary. "Thomas has good taste. Mary is lovely." "Gets that from his mother," Owen said, pressing a kiss to Julia's temple. "Good taste in choosing a spouse." Julia laughed, the sound as warm and welcome to Owen's ears as it had been from the first time he heard it. "I seem to recall you did the choosing, Mr. Zachariah." "You asked me to stay, remember? Best decision I ever made," Owen replied, taking her hand in his. His fingers traced the simple gold band he'd placed there 2 decades ago. 20 years. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday," Julia mused, watching Rebecca join the dancing, her fiancé David gazing at her with undisguised adoration. "Other times, it's as if I've always been here with you." Owen nodded, understanding perfectly. "Either way, I'm grateful." As the music shifted to a slower melody, Owen stood and extended his hand to his wife. "Dance with me." Julia placed her hand in his, rising gracefully despite the arthritis that had begun to trouble her on cold mornings. "Always." They moved into the yard, joining the other dancers. Owen's hand rested at the small of Julia's back, guiding her with the same steady sureness he had shown in everything from delivering their children to building their home. They had both changed over the years, Julia's chestnut hair now threaded with silver, Owen's face more deeply lined, but the way they moved together had only grown more natural, more perfect with time. "You remember what you said to me that first night?" Julia asked as they swayed to the music. "When I knocked on your door," Owen's eyes crinkled at the corners. "You'll eat before you tell me your name," he quoted. "I was trying to be gruff, didn't want you to see how your arrival had shaken me." "I was so afraid," Julia admitted. "Afraid you'd turn me away, afraid for my baby, afraid of the future." "And now?" Owen asked, his gaze tender on her face. Julia looked around at the home they had built, the family they had raised, the life they had created from that desperate beginning. "Now I know that the moment you opened your door was the moment my life truly began," she said simply. "Everything that matters started there." Owen drew her closer, his arms strong and secure around her. "For me too," he murmured against her hair. "You brought light back into my world, Julia. Made me believe in second chances." Above them, stars punctured the velvet Wyoming sky, the same stars that had witnessed their beginning 20 years before. Around them, their children laughed and danced, their friends celebrated, and the ranch that had once been a solitary man's refuge hummed with the vibrant energy of the life they had built together. "Thank you," Owen whispered, the words meant for her alone, "for knocking on my door." "Thank you," Julia replied, her heart full to overflowing, "for answering." As midnight approached and the celebration continued around them, Owen led Julia away from the crowd, back to the porch of the cabin where their story had begun. In the silver light of the full moon, he kissed her with the same tenderness he had shown on their wedding day, a kiss that held the promise of all the years still to come. "I love you, Julia Zachariah," he said, the words as fresh and true as the first time he had spoken them. "And I love you, Owen Zachariah," she replied, her hand finding his as naturally as breathing. "Today, tomorrow, and for all the days we have left." Together they stood on the threshold of their home, surrounded by the legacy of their love, a thriving ranch, 3 remarkable children, a community they had helped build. From desperate beginnings on a stormy night had grown this abundant life, proof that sometimes the greatest journeys begin with a simple act of kindness and the courage to open a door.